Hi, I'm Hannah. By now you've probably built your lanterns, but in this video I'm here to talk a bit about how you might want to decorate your lanterns about. So it's the materials you might use, the techniques you might use, the designs you might want to put on them, all of those things, some tips and tricks and advice. That's what this video is here for. Today I'll be working on a flat lantern, but lanterns can come in all shapes and sizes, and this one's shaped like a cow. And when you're decorating them, you might be inspired by the shape. You might choose to decorate a cow-shaped lantern like a cow, but you might choose to paint something completely different on it. This one, it's a cone, it could be a tent, it could be a hat, it could be decorated in all kinds of ways. Of course, if you do have a flat lantern, you can decorate it as a whole canvas. You could decorate each panel with a different type of design. And even if a lantern's flat, it doesn't have to be square. It could be a triangle or any other shape. Lanterns can be simple, but if you want to go for all the details, lanterns can also be really complicated in detail. This is also another example of how you could decorate a lantern, because this one's been decorated by sticking black paper strips onto it rather than with paint. The effect from decorating it with paper strips will also be slightly different, as whereas the paint, the light will show through, whereas the paper will block the light in a few places and make the light shine out a bit differently from the lantern. Now we'll talk briefly about the types of materials you might want to use to decorate a lantern. It is possible to decorate lanterns using paper strips, but you can also use things like pens and paint. If you're using pens, it's important that you use a water-based pen like a Crayola felt tip pen, because you want something where the ink, once you've drawn on it, will be transparent, so it still lets the light come out of the lantern. If you're using paints, I would recommend using watercolour paints. You don't want to use acrylic paints or poster paints, because those will block the light coming out of your lantern. Whereas if you use watercolours, you can paint all your beautiful decorations on the surface, but the light will still shine through. So now that we've talked about the materials and how you might decorate your lantern, let's get into the demonstration. If you feel confident to, you can go in and draw on the lantern immediately, just onto the lantern. You can draw with a pencil. Just if you're drawing with a pencil, be careful you don't mistakenly puncture the tissue of the lantern. So if you are worried about that, you could try drawing with a felt tip pen instead, because if you choose a light color, it won't interfere too much, but then that's not going to break the tissue of the lantern. If you don't feel confident to draw onto the lantern directly, you could draw out some shapes on a piece of paper and then use them to trace round onto the lantern so that you've planned your shape out in advance. Now that I've drawn around that, and just you can see the faint shape of the butterfly, you can add more detail to it with the pen. In this case, I'm adding back in the shape of its body and the divides between the wings. You could colour it all in with pens, but you could also use paint to fill in the shape. You could paint freehand as well, but in this case, it just having the outline from the pen makes it a little bit easier to see where the edges of the butterfly shape are. With either drawing or painting, you can make it as simple or as detailed as you would like. You could fill it all in one colour, or use different colours to shading, or just make it really colourful. Now that I've shown drawing around a template, I thought I'd demonstrate how to freehand a simple pattern, because like with a drawing, a pattern, you can make it simple, you can make it complicated, you can do it however you think you want to do or will look nice on your lantern. For this pattern, I'm simply swirling the pens back and forth in a wavy pattern, and you could leave it as a single wave, but in this instance I'm going to go in with waves going the opposite way in a different colour. You could also, rather than draw around the template, you could also just use them as a reference. Like this eye here, I could take a pen and draw, having sketched it out first, use the template like my sketch. For an eye, it's kind of like an oval shape, except it's pointy at both ends, with a circle in the middle, and a circle in the middle of that. You could also use the water on the edges of the pen lines to make the ink run and blend. So in that way, using the pens a little bit like paint, because if you've used water-based felt tip pens, then the ink will very naturally run with just a little bit of water. Some colours of ink will run a little bit better than others, so if it doesn't run quite, some pens you find run more than others, that is something I found to be quite common. But if you find that the pen doesn't quite run the way you want to, you can always go over top of it with some paint to add a bit more colour in. If you wanted to do patterns, you can add those with paints as well. If you're working with watercolours, the more water you add with your paint, the lighter the colour will be. So if the watercolour comes out lighter than you're expecting, that probably means you just need to dip your brush into the paint again. You've got a bit too much water and not enough of the pigment. Something else that you can do is if you have a bit of water on there and you put some paint in it and you then tilt your lantern, it might run a little bit in one direction. You can use that technique of adding water, adding some paint, and tipping the lantern to see where the paint runs. That's quite good if you want to create just an abstract colour. If you have a spray bottle, you might also be able to spray it to encourage the water to run. The type of tissue that the lanterns are made of is designed to cope well with water. So although it looks like it's getting wet, unlike normal tissue paper, the lantern won't be damaged by putting the water on it. Once it dries, it will go back to being strung the way it was before. You can see that already on the butterfly that's starting to dry, that the areas of it that are most dry are now more the way they were. The theme for the parade this year is to do with the history of the village and the brick pits near the village. I like drawing buildings, and so I thought I would demonstrate drawing a building inspired by the sorts of buildings that they might have had at the brickworks. Now, that doesn't have to be a complicated shape. A lot of drawing buildings is actually simplifying it. That it's a long rectangle with some triangular roofs and then really tall rectangle on the top for a chimney. If you want to, you could add some smoke coming out. You could draw some brick shapes like a pattern. Also, if you're doing this in multiple layers, if you're using pens and paints, if it doesn't look perfect on the first layer, that doesn't matter. It can all be adjusted with further layers. And with things like these pens and the watercolors, the water will soften it. So if you get a blob you don't like, you can usually use a bit of water to soften it out and change it into something a bit different. I'm going to demonstrate, I mentioned earlier, just doing more abstract color. But this panel here, thought I could just show something that's not necessarily depicting anything, but it's just adding color to the lantern. So for this one, I will tilt it around a bit to see if any of the colors will run and do interesting things. When you're painting an abstract thing on the tissue paper, you can get some quite interesting effects where the water pools in different places because of the texture of the tissue paper. Where there's wrinkles, you'll get stronger color in places and lighter color in places. You can already see that as I'm holding it, as I'm tilting it, that some of the colors are starting to run and pool in the lower sections around the wrinkles. Here is the final version of this lantern. The techniques I've demonstrated today, it's just a few ideas on how you might like to decorate your lantern, but use your imagination. There's so many different ways that you can decorate it, so many different things you could put on your lantern, whether it's inspired by the shape of the lantern or whether it's something completely different to what your lantern's shaped like. I hope this has been helpful and it will give you lots of ideas to get started on decorating.